Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
This is Jonah Sanders, and I'll be narrating this documentary. You may ask, why am I interested in this subject and as to why I care? To answer that question, I was inmate number 1210898. Mass incarceration in the United States is one of the most significant and controversial issues facing the country today. The phenomenon, which has resulted in the U.S. having the largest prison population in the world, did not occur overnight but developed over several decades. It is the product of a variety of social, political, and economic factors, as well as changes in laws and policies that have had a profound impact on American society, particularly on minority communities.
When we think of prisons, if we bother to think of them at all, that is, there is a tendency to see them as institutions completely divorced from human society.
To understand the rise of mass incarceration, one must first consider the history of the U.S.
Said today the inmate population of federal and state prisons in this country is at an all-time high.
Criminal justice system. In the early 20th century, the prison population in America was relatively modest. However, the country's incarceration rate began to grow rapidly after the 1970s.
Population explosion in America.
Overcrowding in this country's jails and prisons.
Prison populations are exploding. There are high bars today. The U.S., they say,
This shift can be traced back to several key moments in American history, beginning with the Civil Rights Movement, which brought issues of racial inequality and crime to the forefront of political discourse. During the 1960s, the U.S. saw a significant rise in crime rates, particularly in urban areas. This increase in crime, combined with the social unrest of the time, led politicians and policymakers to focus heavily on law and order. President Lyndon B. Johnson launched a war on crime, which laid the groundwork for future policies. However, it was under President Richard Nixon in the early 1970s that the rhetoric around crime began to escalate. Nixon famously declared a war on drugs, which marked the beginning of a series of punitive laws and enforcement measures aimed at reducing drug-related crime.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
The war on drugs, launched officially in 1971, played a pivotal role in the explosion of the U.S. prison population. This campaign, which sought to combat drug addiction and drug-related crime, led to the passing of harsh drug laws, including mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, and zero-tolerance policies. These laws disproportionately targeted minority communities, particularly African Americans and Latinos, who were more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Mandatory minimum sentences, in particular, removed much of the discretion from judges, forcing them to impose lengthy prison sentences for even non-violent drug offenses. For instance, under federal law, a person convicted of possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine was subject to the same mandatory minimum sentence as someone convicted of possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. Since crack cocaine was more commonly used in poorer, minority communities, this disparity led to a significant racial imbalance in drug-related incarcerations. In the 1980s and 1990s, the political landscape became even more focused on crime control. Both Democrats and Republicans adopted tough-on-crime stances, viewing harsh penalties as a way to win votes. The passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 were two landmark pieces of legislation that contributed to the growing prison population. The 1994 crime bill, in particular, was signed into law by President Bill Clinton and is often cited as a major catalyst for mass incarceration. It included provisions that expanded the use of the death penalty, implemented the three strikes law, which mandated life sentences for repeat offenders, and provided funding for the construction of more prisons. The bill also introduced truth in sentencing laws, which required prisoners to serve a larger percentage of their sentences before becoming eligible for parole. While these policies were intended to curb violent crime and make communities safer, they had the unintended consequence of dramatically increasing the number of people behind bars, and they are perpetuated by discriminatory policies and practices at every stage of the criminal justice process, from arrest to sentencing. The socio-economic consequences of mass incarceration are staggering. Families are often torn apart, with children growing up in single-parent households while one or both parents are incarcerated. Former prisoners face significant barriers to reintegration into society as they struggle to find employment and housing due to their criminal records. This cycle of poverty and incarceration disproportionately affects low-income communities, creating a vicious cycle that is difficult to break.
I don't see it as really any different from mass incarceration. COVID really made the business boom because the bench was on board with, we have to clear the jails because of COVID. And so a lot of them said, okay, private home detention. And I don't think they realize the impact that it has on the clients.
What is it that people go through? How is it a hardship?
I have clients who struggle with losing their jobs. They lose their children sometimes, all because they can't go out and work or they can't leave their home. It's crazy to have to go through all that when the end result could very well just be probation, no jail time, no deprivation of liberty, just continued supervision.
Which is to say, you could be, like, the punishment before you're convicted could be worse than the punishment after you're convicted.
It's a condition that the court imposes to keep you somewhere, and private companies are benefiting, and you haven't even been found guilty of a crime.
The financial burden of mass incarceration on the U.S. economy is also substantial. It costs the country billions of dollars each year to maintain its prison system. In 2020, the total expenditure on corrections at the federal, state, and local levels exceeded $80 billion. These funds could be used for other social services such as education, healthcare, and job training, which could help reduce crime in the long term. In recent years, there has been growing recognition that the U.S. criminal justice system is in dire need of reform. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and politicians across the political spectrum have called for changes to the laws and policies that contribute to mass incarceration. The movement for reform has gained momentum, particularly in the wake of high-profile cases of police brutality and racial injustice, which have brought renewed attention to the systemic inequalities in the criminal justice system. Several states have already implemented reforms aimed at reducing the prison population. These reforms include reducing mandatory minimum sentences, expanding drug treatment and diversion programs, and providing more opportunities for parole. At the federal level, the passage of the First Step Act in 2018 marked a significant step toward reform. This bipartisan legislation reduced mandatory minimum sentences for certain nonviolent drug offenses and allowed for early release for some federal prisoners. While the movement for criminal justice reform is gaining traction, the path to reducing mass incarceration in the U.S. is still fraught with challenges. The deeply ingrained punitive mindset that has shaped American policy for decades will not be easy to change. Furthermore, there are still powerful political and economic interests that benefit from the current system, including private prison companies and law enforcement agencies that receive funding based on the number of arrests and incarcerations. However, there is hope that meaningful change can occur. The increasing awareness of the flaws in the U.S. criminal justice system, coupled with the rise of grassroots movements and advocacy groups, has created a window of opportunity for reform. The question remains whether the U.S. will seize this moment to address the root causes of mass incarceration and build a more just and equitable society. The rise of mass incarceration in America is a complex issue with deep historical, social, and political roots. It has had far-reaching consequences, particularly for minority communities, and has strained the U.S. economy. While there have been some positive steps toward reform, much work remains to be done to address the systemic issues that contribute to the over-incarceration of millions of Americans. The future of criminal justice reform will depend on sustained advocacy, policy changes, and a shift in societal attitudes toward crime and punishment. Only by addressing these challenges can the U.S. hope to reduce its reliance on incarceration and create a more just and humane system for all. The prison industrial complex is a term used to describe the interconnected relationship between government, private industry, and the criminal justice system, all of which profit from the mass incarceration of individuals in the United States. It reflects a system in which incarceration has become a booming business, with financial interests deeply entrenched in the continued expansion of the prison population. The rise of mass incarceration in the U.S. has not only impacted communities, particularly minority and low-income groups, but has also created a multi-billion-dollar industry that thrives on maintaining high incarceration rates. The economic incentives of the prison industrial complex have led to significant debates about the morality of profiting from imprisonment, and whether this dynamic has contributed to the country's unprecedented rates of incarceration. In the early 1970s, the United States saw a dramatic shift in its approach to criminal justice. Prior to this period, incarceration was not seen as a primary solution for addressing crime. However, the combination of rising crime rates, growing political and public pressure for stricter law enforcement, and the onset of the war on drugs, declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, marked the beginning of an era in which mass incarceration became central to American criminal justice policy. As prison populations grew, so did the need for new facilities to house inmates, creating opportunities for private companies to step in and profit from the demand. One of the most significant developments in the prison industrial complex has been the privatization of prisons. In the mid-1980s, private companies began to build and operate prisons for profit, a practice that quickly spread across the country. Companies such as Corrections Corporation of America, now Core Civic, and Geo Group, are among the largest private prison operators, and they have played a pivotal role in the expansion of the prison population. Private prisons are contracted by state and federal governments to house inmates, and these contracts are often based on the number of beds filled, meaning that higher incarceration rates directly translate into increased revenue for these companies. This financial model creates a perverse incentive to keep prisons full, as empty cells result in lost profits. The growth of private prisons has been accompanied by an increase in lobbying efforts to influence criminal justice policies. Private prison companies have spent millions of dollars lobbying state and federal lawmakers to implement and maintain tough-on-crime policies that result in longer sentences and more incarcerations. These lobbying efforts have helped to sustain the high incarceration rates that are necessary for private prison companies to continue profiting. In some cases, private prison corporations have even written legislation themselves, such as Arizona's controversial SB 1070 immigration law, which was heavily influenced by lobbyists from the private prison industry. This law, which required police to detain individuals suspected of being undocumented immigrants, led to an increase in detentions and consequently more revenue for the private prisons that housed them. While private prisons represent a significant portion of the prison industrial complex, they are not the only entities profiting from mass incarceration. Many other industries have found ways to capitalize on the growing prison population. Companies that provide food, healthcare, telecommunications, and even commissary services to prisons have become major players in the prison economy. For example, prison phone services, provided by companies like Securus Technologies and Globaltel Link, charge exorbitant fees for inmates to make phone calls, often placing an immense financial burden on incarcerated individuals and their families. Similarly, private healthcare providers such as Horizon Health are contracted to provide medical services to prisoners, often under conditions where they prioritize cost-cutting over the well-being of inmates. The prison industrial complex extends beyond the private sector to include government agencies and law enforcement organizations that also benefit from maintaining high incarceration rates. Many local governments and law enforcement agencies receive funding based on the number of arrests made or the size of the prison population. This has led to policies that prioritize mass arrests and lengthy sentences, particularly in areas where prisons serve as a major source of employment and revenue. In some rural communities, prisons have become the largest employers, and local economies depend on the jobs and services associated with incarceration. This dynamic creates a vested interest in keeping prisons full, as reductions in the prison population would lead to economic decline in these areas. The financial incentives of the prison industrial complex have had profound consequences for the American criminal justice system.
Look, right now, while you're looking at this on your screen in your hand or on your computer, there's somebody just like you who's sitting in a prison cell. And they didn't do much more than you did, some crazy weekend. You didn't get caught. They got caught. And they can never get uncaught. The United States of America is now the #1 incarcerator of human beings in the world, in the history of the world. We have about 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. We have more people locked up than China. China, who has 1 billion people, they got fewer prisoners than we do. You know, a lot of times people say, well, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. Really? Have you ever committed a crime? You got people who are doing more drugs on college campuses, in yacht clubs, country clubs. We all know that's going on, but the SWAT team never shows up there. The SWAT team shows up in the housing projects where you got poorer people doing fewer drugs, and those people go to prison. But think about it. What if one of the times when you were breaking the law, when you had something illegal in your pocket, in your car, at your party, the police had kicked in those doors? Would you want to be known for the rest of your life based on what happened that night? That is what is happening to millions of people. If rich folks' kids get in trouble, they go to rehab. Poor folks' kids get in trouble, they go to prison. And you spend $100,000 per year per kid to lock a kid up, when you could have spent a fraction of that and turned them into a NASA scientist, turned them into a fashion icon. When people come home from prison, they're not given the opportunity to start over. You leave a physical prison and you go into a social prison where you can't get a job, you can't get a student loan, you can't rent an apartment. How are people supposed to start over? And what happens to neighborhoods when you take a disproportionate number of people out for minor offenses and you send them back home with no hope and no opportunity? There are no more excuses to have this horrible system continue when there is now finally bipartisan agreement that it is a tragedy to do this. Not only do you have President Obama and the Democrats, you now actually have people like Paul Ryan, Koch Industries, Newt Gingrich, all saying the same thing. We are locking up too many people, we're wasting too much money, we're wasting too much genius in America.
Over the past 4 decades, the U.S. prison population has exploded, growing from roughly 300,000 inmates in the early 1970s to over 2.3 million by the early 21st century. The U.S. now incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world, with 1 in every 100 adults behind bars. The costs of maintaining this massive prison population are staggering. In 2020, the total expenditure on corrections in the U.S. exceeded $80 billion, with much of that money going to private companies and industries that profit from incarceration. Perhaps one of the most troubling aspects of the prison industrial complex is its disproportionate impact on minority communities, particularly African Americans and Latinos. People of color are incarcerated at much higher rates than their white counterparts, and they are more likely to be subjected to the harsh sentencing policies that feed the prison industrial complex. The racial disparities in the criminal justice system are exacerbated by the fact that private prison companies and other industries that profit from incarceration often target minority communities for their facilities and services. For example, many private prisons are built in predominantly minority neighborhoods, and the individuals housed in these prisons are disproportionately people of color. The prison industrial complex has also raised serious ethical questions about the role of profit in the criminal justice system. Critics argue that the for-profit model of incarceration creates an inherent conflict of interest, as companies and industries that profit from incarceration have little incentive to support policies that would reduce the prison population. For example, private prison companies have been known to lobby against criminal justice reforms such as sentencing reductions, alternatives to incarceration, and rehabilitation programs that could lead to fewer incarcerations. This creates a situation in which financial interests are at odds with the goals of reducing crime and promoting public safety. In recent years, there has been growing recognition of the need for criminal justice reform, particularly in light of the disproportionate impact of mass incarceration on minority communities and the role of the prison industrial complex in perpetuating these injustices. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and policymakers have called for an end to the privatization of prisons and the dismantling of the profit-driven system that fuels mass incarceration. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that it would begin phasing out the use of private prisons at the federal level, citing concerns about the quality of services and the high costs associated with for-profit prisons. However, private prisons continue to operate at the state level, and the broader prison industrial complex remains firmly entrenched in the U.S. criminal justice system.
I think it's quite exciting that it's a term that has acquired a kind of currency. At the very beginning, when it was introduced, it was always necessary to engage in a rather long conversation explaining the meaning of the prison industrial complex. Of course, the resonances with the military industrial complex are what most people immediately think about. But as I think back, I remember that we were attempting to capture the globality of the organization of punishment, even as we were very specifically attempting to create a way to understand why it was that such huge numbers of people were in prison in the U.S., the racial disparities of the prison population, and at the same time, the decline of education, of healthcare, and so forth. I think what was so important about that term was that it moved us away from simply thinking about punishment or jails and prisons in isolation from everything else. And even though many of us in that movement had been doing work around prisons for decades, and initially very specifically around political prisoners, and I always like to point out that that without the aid of people in prison, we would not have been able to begin to craft a larger analysis of the role of the prison. And I'm thinking about George Jackson, who argued, back in the late '60s and the early '70s that we needed to think not only about the prison as the site of political repression of people who were engaging in social justice activism in the so-called free world, but we had to try to begin to understand how that apparatus was key to the way racism functioned in our society. So there were a lot of questions that were questions, and many of them are still questions. But I think what was most important was precisely that it allowed us to ask questions, and it made people recognize that what they thought they knew, they really didn't know. And I think that as we try to move the conversation more toward abolition today, that posture of raising questions is what is most important about the way that the prison industrial complex as a concept has functioned. Mm-hmm.
Racial disparities and systemic racism in the U.S. prison system have been persistent issues for decades, and they are deeply intertwined with the broader social, economic, and political fabric of the country. These disparities are evident at every stage of the criminal justice process, from arrest to sentencing to incarceration. The disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities, in particular, reflects a long history of racial inequality that has been perpetuated by both explicit and implicit biases within the system. The result is a prison population that is overwhelmingly composed of people of color, despite evidence that crime rates do not vary significantly between racial groups. Addressing these disparities requires a fundamental rethinking of how the U.S. approaches criminal justice and the role that race plays in shaping the experiences of those who come into contact with the system. The overrepresentation of people of color in the U.S. prison system is one of the most glaring manifestations of racial disparities in criminal justice. African Americans and Latinos make up roughly 60% of the prison population, despite representing only about 30% of the overall U.S. population. According to the NAACP, African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans, and 1 in 3 Black men can expect to go to prison at some point in their lives. Latinos are also disproportionately represented in the prison system, particularly in states with large immigrant populations. These disparities are even more pronounced when considering the impact of mass incarceration on young men of color. For example, black men between the ages of 18 and 24 are far more likely to be incarcerated than their white peers, with devastating consequences for their families and communities. The roots of racial disparities in the U.S. prison system can be traced back to the country's history of slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, the criminal justice system became a tool for maintaining racial control, particularly in the South. The Black Codes, which were laws passed in southern states to restrict the freedom of African Americans, criminalized activities such as loitering, vagrancy, and unemployment, leading to the mass arrest and incarceration of black men. These laws were part of a broader system of racial oppression that continued through the Jim Crow era, during which segregation and racial discrimination were legally enforced. The criminal justice system played a key role in enforcing these laws, and African Americans were routinely subjected to harsher sentences and treatment than their white counterparts. Even after the formal end of Jim Crow laws in the 1960s, racial disparities in the criminal justice system persisted, exacerbated by the rise of the war on drugs in the 1980s. The war on drugs, launched by President Richard Nixon and intensified under President Ronald Reagan, led to a dramatic increase in arrests and incarceration for drug-related offenses, particularly in Black and Latino communities.
Researching about crack and the war on drugs after I finished a book on the Black Panther Party. And this grew out of an interest of trying to understand the period after the civil rights and the Black Power movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think this period is incredibly important because it's really the building of what we call mass incarceration. It begins in the early 70s and then begins to accelerate. And the war on drugs played a seminal role in it, both the first war on drugs under Nixon and then especially the so-called second war on drugs under Ronald Reagan. But it became a kind of structure of punishment that each president, starting with actually a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson in 1965, and then Richard Nixon, and then really Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And the single biggest period of incarceration in the United States at the state and federal level was actually under Bill Clinton in the 1990s. So I think that when we're looking at the contemporary problems today, understanding the mass protests that we had in Ferguson and Charlotte and other cities across the country, none of that can be understood without looking at the state punishment apparatus. The reason I also am studying crack is that the crack crisis or the crack epidemic was the primary rationale for the war on drugs. So one of the things I remember having come of age during this period is that no one was talking about the war on drugs. Everyone was talking about crack. So it's impossible to write about one without writing about another. The second reason is that crack itself, the cocaine economy that grew out of the anti-communist wars in Central America, which led to the vast expansion of this illicit selling of cocaine in the United States, this wrought destruction within all different kinds of communities. African American communities, but many other communities were using crack as well. Although you didn't see the rhetoric of race in the same way you did with African Americans, according to the National Institute for Drug Abuse, 2/3 of crack users were white. And thinking about how this is linked to our contemporary moment, there's a lot of discussion about the opioid crisis. And it's obvious the contrast in the kinds of sympathetic ways that opioid users are represented. You know, white communities, white victims, public health, seekers versus illicit users of moral failing. That contrast is clear. But I also think that in some ways, as we look at what's going on with these communities in the opioid crisis, it's important to go back to that archive of what happened in the crack era. Families being torn asunder, children being sacrificed to foster care, long-term criminalization. The war on drugs continues even during the opioid crisis. So I think it's important both to understand mass incarceration, but also to interpret the drug crises of today.
The racial disparities in the U.S. prison system are not limited to drug offenses. They extend to nearly every category of crime. African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be arrested, charged, and convicted of crimes than their white counterparts, even when controlling for the severity of the offense. This pattern reflects the role of racial profiling and biased policing practices, which disproportionately target communities of color. The use of stop and frisk tactics in cities like New York is one example of how law enforcement policies have disproportionately affected Black and Latino individuals. Under stop and frisk, police officers were empowered to stop and search individuals they deemed suspicious, leading to widespread racial profiling. Data from the New York Civil Liberties Union shows that between 2002 and 2013, more than 80% of those stopped were Black or Latino, even though these groups make up less than half of the city's population. The vast majority of those stopped were found to be innocent, but the practice contributed to the over-policing of communities of color and the funneling of young Black and Latino men into the criminal justice system. Once individuals of color are arrested, they face further racial disparities in the judicial process. Studies have shown that African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be charged with crimes that carry longer sentences, such as violent offenses, even when white individuals commit similar acts. Additionally, people of color are often at a disadvantage when it comes to legal representation, as many cannot afford private attorneys and are reliant on overworked public defenders. This disparity in legal resources can result in harsher plea deals, wrongful convictions, and longer sentences for Black and Latino defendants. Furthermore, racial bias can influence judicial decision-making, whether consciously or unconsciously. Research has shown that Black defendants are more likely to be sentenced to death than white defendants, particularly when the victim is white. This racial bias in sentencing is a clear example of systemic racism at work within the criminal justice system. The impact of these racial disparities in incarceration extends far beyond the individuals who are imprisoned. Mass incarceration has devastating effects on families and communities, particularly in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Children of incarcerated parents are more likely to experience poverty, unstable housing, and emotional trauma. In many cases, the loss of a parent to incarceration creates a cycle of disadvantage that is difficult to break, as children who grow up in households affected by incarceration are more likely to become involved in the criminal justice system themselves. The economic consequences of mass incarceration are also significant, as formerly incarcerated individuals often struggle to find employment and housing due to their criminal records. This can lead to higher rates of recidivism, as individuals who are unable to secure stable employment may resort to illegal activities to survive. One of the most high-profile criminal justice reform efforts has been the push to reduce the use of cash bail, which disproportionately affects people of color. Under the cash bail system, individuals who are unable to afford bail must remain in jail while awaiting trial, often for months or even years. This has a particularly devastating impact on low-income Black and Latino defendants, who are more likely to be held in pretrial detention simply because they cannot afford to pay bail. Efforts to reform or eliminate cash bail have gained traction in several states, with advocates arguing that the system unfairly punishes people of color and exacerbates racial disparities in incarceration. In conclusion, racial disparities and systemic racism in the U.S. prison system have been pervasive and enduring issues that reflect the broader racial inequalities in American society. From racial profiling and biased policing to disparities in sentencing and parole, people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, are disproportionately affected at every stage of the criminal justice process. The over-incarceration of people of color has devastating social, economic, and political consequences, perpetuating cycles of poverty, disenfranchisement, and disadvantage. While there have been important efforts to address these disparities through criminal justice reform, much work remains to be done to dismantle the systemic. Corruption in private prisons has become a significant issue in the U.S. criminal justice system, highlighting a troubling conflict between the profit motives of private corporations and the fundamental goal of rehabilitation for incarcerated individuals. As the privatization of prisons has expanded over the past few decades, critics have argued that the prioritization of profit by private prison companies often comes at the expense of inmate welfare, rehabilitation programs, and public safety. The inherent tension between maximizing profits and ensuring humane and rehabilitative conditions has resulted in widespread allegations of corruption, abuse, and exploitation within the private prison system. Private prisons, which are operated by for-profit companies, have grown in prominence since the 1980s, spurred by the rise of mass incarceration and the war on drugs. As the U.S. prison population exploded, public prisons became overcrowded, leading governments to turn to private companies to manage some of their incarcerated population. Companies like CoreCivic, formerly Corrections Corporation of America, and Geo Group quickly became major players in the prison industry, entering into contracts with federal and state governments to house inmates in privately run facilities. These contracts are often structured in such a way that private prison companies are paid based on the number of inmates they house, creating a financial incentive to maintain high levels of incarceration. This profit-driven model has led to numerous instances of corruption, as private prison companies have been accused of cutting corners to maximize profits, leading to unsafe conditions, inadequate health care, and a lack of rehabilitative services. One of the most troubling aspects of private prisons is the way in which they prioritize profit over rehabilitation. Rehabilitation should be one of the central goals of the criminal justice system, as it aims to reduce recidivism and help individuals reintegrate into society upon release. However, private prison companies have little incentive to invest in effective rehabilitation programs, as reducing recidivism could result in fewer inmates and therefore less revenue. Instead, these companies often focus on minimizing costs, which can mean providing only the bare minimum in terms of services and support for inmates. This lack of focus on rehabilitation has been criticized as a major contributor to the high recidivism rates in the U.S., as many inmates are released from private prisons without having received the education, job training, or mental health treatment they need to successfully re-enter society. Cost-cutting measures in private prisons frequently result in substandard living conditions for inmates. These facilities often suffer from overcrowding, understaffing, and poor maintenance, all of which can lead to dangerous and unhealthy environments. In some cases, private prisons have been found to provide inadequate food, medical care, and mental health services, putting inmates' health and well-being at risk. For example, a 2019 report by the U.S. Department of Justice found that private prisons were more dangerous than public prisons, with higher rates of assaults, use of force by guards, and lockdowns. The report also highlighted significant deficiencies in healthcare and security, raising serious concerns about the ability of private prisons to ensure the safety and well-being of inmates. Despite these findings, private prison companies have continued to secure lucrative contracts with federal and state governments, largely due to the perception that they can operate more cost-effectively than public prisons. In addition to corrupt dealings with government officials, private prison companies have also been criticized for their role in lobbying for tougher sentencing laws and policies that increase incarceration rates. Organizations like Core Civic and Geo Group have spent millions of dollars on lobbying efforts and political contributions, often targeting lawmakers who support policies that lead to higher rates of imprisonment. For example, private prison companies have been strong supporters of three strikes laws, mandatory minimum sentences, and truth in sentencing policies, all of which have contributed to the growth of the U.S. prison population. By advocating for these policies, private prison companies ensure a steady supply of inmates to fill their facilities, even as many states move toward criminal justice reform and efforts to reduce incarceration. The influence of private prison companies on public policy extends beyond the U.S. borders. In recent years, private prison companies have increasingly turned to immigration detention as a new source of revenue. With the rise in immigration enforcement and the detention of undocumented immigrants, private companies have secured contracts to operate immigration detention centers, many of which are run under the same profit-driven model as private prisons. As with traditional private prisons, immigration detention centers have been plagued by allegations of abuse, neglect, and inadequate conditions. Reports have surfaced of overcrowded facilities, insufficient medical care, and poor sanitation, leading to concerns about the treatment of immigrants in detention. Private prison companies have been accused of profiting from the suffering of immigrants, many of whom are held in detention for prolonged periods without access to legal representation or due process. The debate over private prisons raises important questions about the role of profit in the criminal justice system and the ethical implications of outsourcing the care and custody of incarcerated individuals to for-profit companies. Critics argue that private prisons are fundamentally incompatible with the goals of justice and rehabilitation, as the profit motives of these companies often lead to cost-cutting measures that harm inmates and undermine public safety. Moreover, the influence of private prison companies on public policy raises concerns about the fairness and integrity of the criminal justice system, as these companies have a vested interest in maintaining high levels of incarceration, even as the public calls for reform. Corruption in private prisons represents a profound challenge to the integrity of the U.S. criminal justice system. The prioritization of profit over rehabilitation has led to unsafe conditions, inadequate services, and widespread allegations of abuse and exploitation. Furthermore, the influence of private prison companies on public policy has contributed to the perpetuation of mass incarceration and the erosion of efforts to reform the system. To address these issues, it is essential to critically examine the role of private prisons in the U.S. and to consider alternatives that prioritize rehabilitation, fairness, and justice over profit. Ending the corruption and profit motives in private prisons is a crucial step toward creating a more humane and effective criminal justice system that serves the needs of society rather than the interests of corporate shareholders. Inhumane living conditions in prisons, particularly overcrowding and neglect, have long been a pressing issue in the U.S. criminal justice system. Overcrowding, which occurs when the number of inmates exceeds the capacity of a facility, leads to numerous human rights violations, compromised safety, and a lack of access to essential services such as medical care, mental health treatment, and rehabilitative programs. This crisis has been exacerbated by decades of tough-on-crime policies, including mandatory minimum sentences and the war on drugs, which have resulted in a dramatic increase in the U.S. prison population. As a consequence, prisoners are often forced to live in deplorable conditions that not only violate their basic rights but also impede their chances of rehabilitation and reintegration into society. The issue of overcrowding is most evident in the sheer number of people housed in facilities designed for far fewer occupants. Many prisons operate well beyond their intended capacity, forcing inmates into cramped and unsanitary living quarters. Cells built to hold 1 or 2 individuals often accommodate double or triple that number, leading to a lack of personal space and a breakdown of order within the facility. Prisoners may be forced to sleep on the floor, share small, inadequate bathroom facilities, and live in conditions where basic hygiene is difficult to maintain. This overcrowding increases tension and violence among inmates, as confined spaces and a lack of privacy contribute to heightened stress levels. In some cases, guards and staff are outnumbered, making it difficult for them to effectively manage the inmate population or respond to incidents of violence and unrest. Overcrowding also creates significant challenges in providing adequate healthcare and mental health services to inmates. With more prisoners to care for than staff or resources can handle, many inmates are left without proper medical attention, leading to worsening health conditions or even preventable deaths. Common ailments such as chronic illnesses go untreated and emergency medical care is often delayed. Inmates with mental health issues are particularly vulnerable in these conditions, as overcrowded facilities typically lack the resources to provide adequate psychiatric care or counseling. Many inmates suffering from mental illness are left untreated or placed in isolation, which can exacerbate their condition and lead to further deterioration of their mental state. The lack of access to health care in overcrowded prisons is not only a public health crisis but also a violation of inmates' rights to receive proper medical care while in custody. Neglect is another major issue that stems from overcrowding, as prison staff are often overwhelmed and unable to meet the basic needs of the inmate population. Inadequate staffing levels mean that guards and medical personnel are stretched thin, leading to delayed responses to medical emergencies, neglect of prisoners' basic needs, and a lack of oversight that allows abuse and violence to go unchecked. Neglect can manifest in various ways, from failing to provide inmates with adequate food, clean water, and sanitation facilities to ignoring reports of abuse or mistreatment. In overcrowded prisons, staff often prioritize maintaining order over addressing individual inmates' concerns, resulting in widespread neglect and human rights violations. In many cases, inmates are left to suffer in silence, with no recourse to report their treatment or seek help from outside authorities. The consequences of overcrowding and neglect are not limited to physical health issues. The mental and emotional toll of living in such conditions can be devastating. Inmates in overcrowded prisons often experience severe stress, anxiety, and depression due to the constant noise, lack of privacy, and fear of violence.
MDLC, if you don't have a family member or a loved one there, but some child's father is there, some mother's son is there.
The psychological effects of overcrowding can lead to behavioral issues, making it more difficult for inmates to engage in rehabilitative programs or maintain good behavior. Furthermore, the lack of access to mental health services means that inmates struggling with mental health issues are often left untreated, leading to higher rates of self-harm, suicide, and aggression. The psychological impact of overcrowding and neglect can have long-lasting effects on inmates, making it more difficult for them to reintegrate into society upon release and increasing the likelihood of recidivism.
52% of the African male population in the city is unemployed. And the reason being is the fact that they have had some contact with the criminal justice system. My name is Jonah Sanders, and I'm a native New Orleanian. I spent 27 years, 10 months and 18 days in prison. I was charged with second-degree murder for a crime that proven that I didn't do. I came home, already had food, clothing, and shelter, had a job waiting for me that had been waiting for me for over 10 years. And I tell people my transition was completely flawless. But I understand what it's like to be coming home with nowhere to go. And so we're trying to eliminate that out here by yourself. No, we're here. We're that safety net. And we're just trying to raise the consciousness of people about what reentry is supposed to look like. And this is the end product.
Basically, everybody in my community is in prison. All the mothers like me, we get together now because all of our kids are in jail. All of our kids are doing like 30 to 25 years. We see each other the first day of school when our kids are 4. Now at the age of 17 in New Orleans, we see each other again when it's time to go to the courthouse, to go to prison. I'm a mother of 2 kids. One of my kids are incarcerated. One of my kids have 30 years. I have 3 grandkids, and I'm a formerly incarcerated person. Sunday morning at 1 o'clock, I was released from Orleans Parish Prison. I was released from here at 1 in the morning. I live in the Trey May area. Imagine me being a woman, how terrified I was walking from here at 1 o'clock in the morning, making it to Trey May area for like 2-something by myself. But right now there is no help with that. There isn't anything to like try to help you do anything. The program would like, as soon as you call us, we will be here to get you as soon as you're getting out of prison. Yeah. I came home, I don't have a house, I don't have a job, I don't have anything. And most women, when they get out, they go back to the street and do the same thing because there isn't any help out here for them. As a black mother, I feel as if though the system was designed to fail me here. I don't want nobody else to be in the same situation that I was in. No, I just want to help out and lead other people. I'm willing to open up my home and try to turn it into a re-entry to help women.
Furthermore, gang-related violence can disrupt prison operations, making it challenging for staff to maintain order and ensuring the safety of all individuals within the facility. The influence of gangs in prisons extends beyond physical violence. It often includes a range of illicit activities such as drug trafficking, extortion, and organized crime. Gangs can control the flow of contraband within the facility, leading to a rise in violence as they compete for territory and resources. The presence of drugs and other illegal activities can exacerbate tensions, leading to disputes that escalate into violence. Inmates who refuse to align with a gang or who attempt to withdraw from gang involvement may face severe repercussions, including physical assault or even death. This creates an atmosphere of fear and complicity, where inmates feel compelled to participate in gang activities to ensure their safety. Moreover, the lack of adequate mental health services in many prisons further compounds the issue of violence. A significant number of inmates enter prison with pre-existing mental health conditions, and the stresses of incarceration can exacerbate these issues. Without proper treatment, individuals may experience heightened symptoms of anxiety, depression, or aggression, leading to outbursts and violent behavior. Prisons often lack the necessary resources to address the mental health needs of the population, resulting in a system that fails to rehabilitate and support individuals struggling with psychological issues. This neglect can create a volatile environment where violence becomes a means of coping with emotional distress. The culture of violence within prisons is also perpetuated by the lack of accountability for aggressive behavior. Many correctional facilities operate under a system that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, leading to a cycle where violence is often met with further violence. Inmates who engage in violent acts may face harsh disciplinary measures, such as solitary confinement, rather than receiving the support they need to address the underlying issues driving their behavior. This punitive approach can reinforce the notion that violence is an acceptable response to conflict, perpetuating the cycle of aggression and instability within the prison system. The impact of prison violence extends beyond the walls of the facilities. The experiences of inmates who endure violence during their incarceration can have lasting effects on their mental health and well-being, contributing to challenges when reintegrating into society. Many individuals released from prison carry the trauma of their experiences, leading to difficulties in forming healthy relationships and maintaining stable employment. Those who have been exposed to violence may become more likely to engage in aggressive behavior or find themselves involved in criminal activities upon release. The issue of prison violence and gang control has garnered increased attention in recent years, prompting calls for reform and change within the penal system. Advocates argue that addressing the root causes of violence requires a comprehensive approach that prioritizes rehabilitation, mental health services, and a focus on reducing overcrowding. By creating environments that foster healing rather than punishment, prisons can work towards breaking the cycle of violence and gang influence. wrongful convictions represent one of the most troubling aspects of the American legal system, shedding light on systemic flaws and deep-seated injustices that can affect the lives of innocent individuals. The phenomenon of being wrongfully convicted involves the conviction and sentencing of a person for a crime they did not commit, often resulting from a combination of human error, misconduct, and systemic failures within the criminal justice system. This issue is not merely an unfortunate side effect of an imperfect legal process, it underscores significant legal injustices that can have devastating consequences for individuals, families, and communities. The causes of wrongful convictions are varied and complex, with a range of contributing factors that often intersect. One of the most common reasons for wrongful convictions is the reliance on faulty eyewitness testimony. Studies have shown that eyewitnesses can be remarkably unreliable, influenced by a myriad of factors including stress, the presence of a weapon, or leading questions during police interviews. In high-pressure situations, an eyewitness may misidentify a suspect, leading to the wrongful conviction of an innocent person based solely on their flawed memory. The phenomenon of cross-racial identification further complicates matters. Research indicates that individuals are generally less accurate when identifying people of different races, increasing the likelihood of errors in cases involving racially diverse communities. In addition to eyewitness misidentification, the use of flawed forensic evidence has played a significant role in wrongful convictions. Many wrongful conviction cases involve reliance on forensic techniques that have since been discredited or deemed unreliable. For example, hair comparison analysis, bite mark analysis, and other forms of forensic evidence have been called into question for their lack of scientific rigor. The consequences of such reliance can be catastrophic, as defendants may be convicted based on dubious scientific claims that fail to meet modern standards of reliability and validity. In many cases, forensic experts may present evidence in a manner that misleads juries, painting a picture of certainty where there is none. Police misconduct and prosecutorial overreach further exacerbate the problem of wrongful convictions. In some instances, law enforcement officials may engage in coercive interrogation tactics, leading to false confessions from innocent individuals. High-pressure techniques, such as lengthy interrogations or deceptive practices, can cause vulnerable individuals to admit to crimes they did not commit out of fear or desperation. Similarly, prosecutorial misconduct, such as withholding exculpatory evidence, can hinder a fair trial and contribute to wrongful convictions. When prosecutors prioritize winning cases over ensuring justice, the integrity of the legal system is undermined, often to the detriment of innocent defendants. The impact of wrongful convictions extends far beyond the individual who is wrongfully imprisoned. Families of the wrongfully convicted endure immense emotional and financial strain as they grapple with the injustice of their loved one's situation.
Everything was stripped away from me in life. Yeah, I'm mad at God. I'm mad at everybody. I remember the screaming, how can this be happening? It was a nightmare. It was a start of just a nightmare. I'm asking God, man, if you're real, step in right now. I need a savior. I can't do this by myself. I'm crying out. Complete strangers, as well as people of the community, were coming and rallying and just chanting free GK, free GK. It made me feel really good to know that we're getting somewhere. Like, people are fighting for me. You know, there's a reason to have hope now. The Lord had my undivided attention now. That I was sitting there getting to know Him, getting to know Jesus, who He was, and preparing me for the journey I'm about to face. And ultimately, letting me know that I'm gonna be with you through it all.
The social and economic consequences of wrongful convictions are also significant. Each wrongful conviction not only represents a personal tragedy, but also costs taxpayers substantial sums of money. The legal battles involved in wrongful conviction cases can drain state resources, as taxpayers foot the bill for lengthy trials, appeals, and the costs associated with wrongful imprisonment. Furthermore, the system of mass incarceration in the United States exacerbates these issues, as millions of people are caught in a cycle of injustice, often disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. The intersection of race and wrongful convictions is particularly alarming. Studies indicate that individuals from racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be wrongfully convicted than their white counterparts, underscoring systemic biases that persist within the legal framework.
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man.
While living in Brooklyn, New York, Bunn was only 14 years old when he was arrested by NYPD Detective Louis Scarcella. Bunn later spent 16 years behind bars and then 11 years on parole, during which he continued to fight to prove his innocence. Finally, his conviction was overturned due to the misconduct of Detective Scarcella and the fact that there was no probable cause to arrest Bunn in the first place.
I want y'all to know that y'all convicted and had a wrong man in prison.
After 27 years of fighting to clear his name, he was finally exonerated.
I want to thank you, Your Honor, because in 27 years, I've been fighting for my life.
Before leaving the courtroom, he shared a moment with the judge. Bunn later filed a lawsuit against the city of New York and Detective Scarcella. Organizations such as the Innocence Project and the Equal Justice Initiative have been instrumental in raising awareness about the prevalence of wrongful convictions and advocating for necessary reforms. These organizations often work to exonerate individuals who have been wrongfully convicted through DNA testing, legal assistance, and public campaigns aimed at shedding light on systemic flaws within the justice system. In addition to grassroots advocacy, legal reforms are essential for preventing wrongful convictions. Legislative measures such as requiring the recording of interrogations, implementing stricter standards for the admissibility of forensic evidence, and establishing oversight for police and prosecutorial conduct can significantly reduce the risk of wrongful convictions. Creating independent review boards to evaluate cases of alleged wrongful conviction can also provide an avenue for accountability and transparency within the legal system. These reforms not only aim to prevent future injustices, but also work to restore faith in a legal system that is perceived by many as flawed and biased. The role of education and training for law enforcement officials, attorneys, and jurors is also vital in addressing wrongful convictions. Programs that promote awareness of cognitive biases, the limitations of eyewitness testimony, and the importance of fair practices in investigations can help create a more equitable legal environment. Furthermore, increasing public awareness about the risks of wrongful convictions can empower citizens to advocate for justice reform and hold their elected officials accountable. In conclusion, wrongful convictions and legal injustices in U.S. courts represent a systemic failure that not only devastates the lives of innocent individuals, but also undermines the foundational principles of justice and fairness. By addressing the myriad factors that contribute to wrongful convictions, such as unreliable eyewitness testimony, flawed forensic evidence, police misconduct, and prosecutorial overreach, we can begin to build a legal system that prioritizes truth and accountability. Through comprehensive reform efforts, education, and advocacy, it is possible to create a more just and equitable criminal justice system that protects the rights of all individuals and safeguards against the tragedies of wrongful conviction. The pursuit of justice must remain at the forefront of our collective efforts to address these injustices and ensure that the legal system serves as a protector of the innocent rather than a vehicle for their wrongful punishment.